I'm Jacob from the Sustainably Yours Homestead, where we're striving to live a little bit more sustainably each and every day, and we're inviting you to learn along with us. So if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below there. It would really help us out. Now, part of living more sustainably includes learning how to forage for wild foods. But this video is not intended to be a mushroom identification video. I am not at all qualified for that. Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby. Instead, what it is intended to be is just one example of how I've used a wild mushroom called the black staining polypore in my kitchen. So before you go trying this recipe or eating any wild mushroom, a few things that you need to keep in mind. Number one, make sure that you have positively identified that mushroom. If you are not an expert, then you need to have it identified by an expert. If you're a beginning forager, you need to, number one, you get yourself some identification books or some resources to read and compare pictures. And number two, before you ever eat anything that you forage on your own, you need to find yourself a good local expert who will take you out into the field and show you things. Not only show you what is edible, but make sure, more importantly, they show you what is not edible. And then, even after you have positively identified something as edible, it's important to know that not everybody can tolerate the same foods, especially when it comes to mushrooms. Sometimes you can get a hold of a mushroom that is edible, but your particular body just won't tolerate it and it's going to make you sick. So anytime you're trying a new mushroom for the first time, always cook it very well. And also, try just a little bit of it at first. Give yourself about 24 hours to see if your body reacts to it. So with all of that being said, stay tuned because right after the bump, I'm going to show you one way that I've used Meripilus sumstinei, the black staining polypore, in my kitchen. In a previous video, I showed you how I cleaned and processed a specimen of Meripilus sumstinei, the black staining polypore mushroom. I ended up getting about 2 gallons of good usable mushrooms out of that. And so today I'm going to pull those out of the freezer and we're going to make some mushroom stock. Now you can see that the mushrooms, after being frozen for several days, they've absorbed quite a bit of water, but I think texture-wise, they're still pretty close to what they were before I put them in the freezer. You can see they're still kind of fibrous. That's probably due to how old the mushroom was when I harvested it. The recipe that I'm going to be using is loosely based on one that I pulled off of a website called Inside the Outside. It calls for an onion, a couple of cloves of garlic. I'm going to be using the elephant garlic that I harvested just the other day. A couple of stalks of celery, a couple of carrots, some salt, and it calls for peppercorns, but I have this. I don't know how to get it open, so I'm just going to be using freshly cracked pepper. And I'm going to start by crushing my garlic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time chopping or mincing it up. There's no sense in that. We're just going to boil it in the water for flavor. So I'll crush it and then remove all of the papery coating from it. And I just want to make sure that they're nice and crushed so that all of that yummy garlicky goodness can leach out into my broth water. And I'm going to be using an Instapot today instead of a stock pot. I have some errands that I need to run, so this will allow me to set a timer for it. So I'll grab the onion. Now I know there are ways to cut an onion without cutting into the bulb and burning your eyes all up or whatever, but I always tend to just cut both ends and then peel the outer layer off. And this recipe calls for quartering the onion. I'm going to cut mine into 8ths. And then we're just going to drop it on into the crock pot. For the celery, I don't think there's anything wrong with using the leaves, but I just always tend to cut those off, and then I cut the other ends off as well. And we're going to chop this up. I cut them into fairly small pieces. Again, I want everything to be as small as it can so I can get as much of the flavor out of there as easily as possible. And into the crock pot it goes. Now we're on to the carrots. And I'm just going to chop those kind of like what I did with the celery there. And they'll go in with the garlic and onions and celery. Boy, this is starting to look yummy. Now let's add in some salt. The recipe calls for 2 tablespoons. And then lots and lots of freshly cracked black pepper. Now we're ready to start adding in our mushrooms. If you're going to try this at home, I do recommend using a stock pot instead. I did have a little bit of boiling over from the crock pot. I think what happened was the steam kind of got caught up under the lid, and it would build up there, and then it would start spilling out onto the countertop. And so I lost quite a bit there, and I had to add quite a bit of water back into it. Ideally, you want to cover everything with at least 2 inches of water, but I didn't have room to do that in this crock pot. So I put as much water in there as I could, and then I just every so often I checked back with it and added more water as needed. So a stock pot probably would have worked a lot better. But we live and learn, I guess. And finally, it was time to get this stuff cooking, so I put the lid on there, and I decided to use the bake function on this Instapot. I know that will bring water to a boil, so I set the timer for up at 2 hours and 10 minutes. I gave it that extra 10 minutes to give everything time to heat up. And 2 hours and 10 minutes later, this is what we had. I strained out all of the mushrooms and carrots and everything through a fine mesh strainer into a bowl. And then I squeezed every last drop of broth that I could get out of these mushrooms. I set the dry waste aside. That will go into the compost. And it left me with some actually pretty yummy tasting broth. I'm going to set a few cups of this aside so that I can use it for another recipe. And the rest of it is going to go into the deep freeze in a freezer bag until I figure out something that I want to do with it. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button down there, subscribe, leave us a thoughtful comment. I do have some plans already for this mushroom broth. Spoiler alert, I found another black staining Polypore, and this one was pretty young, so I'm going to be making some mushroom jerky. So if you want to see that, or if you're just interested in following along as we continue to try and turn our home into a homestead, then be sure to ring the notification bell so you'll know when to be back for more daily, sustainable living.